Hello, my friends. The international situation at the close of December 2025 reveals a familiar and deeply troubling pattern. Western powers, led by the United States, continue to act with strategic incoherence, while Russia demonstrates clarity, consistency, and patience. Nowhere is this contrast more visible than in Ukraine, but it also appears in seemingly unrelated theaters that nonetheless reflect the same underlying disorder in Western decision-making. Before turning fully to Ukraine, it is worth briefly noting a development that illustrates this broader pattern. The United States recently carried out air and missile strikes in northern Nigeria, in the Sokoto region, claiming to target Islamic State positions. The Nigerian government stated that it had been informed in advance and characterized the operation as cooperative. Yet a detailed report in the Financial Times expressed open skepticism, even bafflement, noting that there is no significant Islamic State presence in Sokoto and that local residents reported the strikes landing on empty fields. I cannot independently verify what occurred on the ground. The Financial Times was once a newspaper of record whose reporting on such matters would rarely be questioned. That reputation, however, has eroded, particularly where U.S. foreign policy and Donald Trump are concerned. It is therefore possible that the strikes were ineffective or misdirected, but certainty is unavailable. What is clear is that Sokoto is not politically or historically neutral terrain. It was once the capital of the Sokoto Caliphate, a powerful Islamic state that dominated much of West Africa in the 19th century. The Sultan of Sokoto remains today a symbolic yet nationally significant figure, regarded as the nominal leader of Nigeria's Muslim population, which constitutes a majority of the country. The city itself was the epicenter of a major political crisis in the 1960 seconds, when Ahmadu Bello, Nigeria's prime minister, and the Sardauna of Sokoto, was assassinated there, an event that helped trigger catastrophic civil conflict. This is not a region into which a foreign power should intervene lightly or carelessly. Whether the United States fully understands the historical and political sensitivities involved is doubtful. The episode reflects a broader tendency, the casual projection of military power without coherent strategic understanding. That same tendency is now on full display in Ukraine. Turning to Ukraine, the dominant issue remains Kyiv's recently unveiled 20-point peace plan. I have already analyzed this proposal in detail, and my conclusion remains unchanged. It is a repackaged attempt to freeze the conflict along existing front lines, while preserving Ukraine's long-term integration into NATO. For that reason alone, it is categorically unacceptable to Russia. Recent reports indicate that Volodymyr Zelensky intends to take this plan to the United States, meeting Donald Trump in Florida, while simultaneously coordinating with European leaders who continue to support Kyiv without reservation. Trump himself is reportedly expected to join one of these calls. Once such developments would have inspired concern. Experience has now replaced concern with grim expectation. The pattern is well established. Whenever the United States appears to make progress toward a realistic understanding with Russia, that progress collapses. The moment Ukraine and the Europeans are brought fully into the discussion, Trump has publicly stated that any plan is meaningless unless he approves it. Some interpret this as a rejection of Zelensky's proposal. Perhaps it is. Yet history suggests otherwise. In previous encounters, Zelensky has usually emerged from meetings with Trump having secured most of what he wanted. Prolonged engagement with European leaders has produced the same result. The substance of the 20-point plan itself confirms its unreality. It does not foreclose NATO membership. On the contrary, by proposing U.S. security guarantees equivalent to those enjoyed by NATO members, it lays the groundwork for eventual accession by another name. It rejects a straightforward withdrawal from Donbass, offering instead conflict freezes or special economic arrangements options Moscow has rejected repeatedly. It also demands that Ukraine maintain an armed force of 800,000 personnel, a figure not only financially impossible for Ukraine, but larger than its current force, implying indefinite Western funding. Ukrainian officials themselves acknowledge that such an army is unaffordable. The only logical conclusion is that the plan assumes an open-ended flow of Western money. That, in truth, appears to be its central purpose. These objections are not limited to Russian analysts. Jennifer Kavanagh, one of the most perceptive observers of the war, recently wrote after visiting Ukraine that the plan is contrary to Ukraine's own interests. The proposed U.S. security guarantees are unenforceable. No one in Ukraine seriously believes that Washington would fight Russia on Ukraine's behalf. The guarantees are therefore meaningless. The proposed force structure is equally illusory. Kavanagh correctly notes that Ukraine's only durable security arrangement would be a return to neutral, non-aligned status, the very condition under which peace prevailed both internally and in Ukraine's relations with Russia. All of this, however, is ultimately academic. Over the past 72 hours, Russia has made unmistakably clear that the plan will not be accepted. This clarity was reflected indirectly in a meeting Vladimir Putin held with Russian business leaders in the Kremlin under conditions of strict confidentiality. The primary topic was domestic, the unresolved legal status of assets privatized in the 1,990 seconds, an issue that has concerned Russian business for decades. Given the sensitivity of that discussion, secrecy was entirely unsurprising. What is relevant is that foreign policy was also discussed. Putin briefed the attendees, as he regularly does, on negotiations with the United States regarding Ukraine. Details of these remarks were later reported by Kommersant, Russia's leading business newspaper, based on second-hand accounts. No journalists were present at the meeting, a point that must be emphasized. The more detailed account came from Kommersant's senior correspondent, Andrei Kolesnikov, a well-connected and widely trusted, if occasionally gossipy, observer. His report has been selectively quoted in Western media, often stripping it of its most revealing elements. According to Kolesnikov, Putin discussed negotiations with the United States, including what were referred to as the Anchorage Agreement's understandings reached earlier between Putin and Trump. Crucially, Putin noted that the Americans had retreated from some of their own proposals after consulting with Europeans. Putin reportedly interpreted this retreat as a sign of weakness. That point has been conspicuously absent from Western reporting. Kolesnikov further stated that Putin indicated Russia remains prepared to honor the concessions it made at Anchorage. In practical terms, this means that while Crimea and Donbass are non-negotiable, limited territorial exchanges elsewhere might be possible within a comprehensive settlement. Donetsk and Lugansk are not open for discussion. Zaporizhia and Kherson are expected to become fully integrated into Russia. Only after recognition of these realities could secondary adjustments be considered. This position has been reinforced repeatedly by Russian officials in recent days. Nothing in Moscow's statements suggests any retreat from these demands. The meeting also touched on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Discussions are reportedly underway regarding possible U.S. involvement, including proposals related to electricity supply and even cryptocurrency mining. Putin made it clear that Ukrainian staff continue to work at the plant, but now as Russian citizens. The implication is unmistakable. The facility will remain under Russian control. Moscow appears unimpressed by American schemes for joint management. The central message emerging from these accounts is stark. The Russians view the United States as strategically weak, not militarily, but politically. Washington cannot maintain a coherent negotiating position because it allows European allies and Ukrainian proxies to veto or dilute its own proposals. Agreements reached directly with Moscow are abandoned as soon as Allied pressures are applied. This assessment aligns precisely with a recent and exceptionally perceptive analysis published by Kotlia the Contemplator, who examined the history of successful U.S. back-channel diplomacy from World War II through the Cold War. Effective back-channels worked because Washington had clear objectives, disciplined execution, and excluded allies until core agreements were reached. None of those conditions apply today. The back channel now in operation is failing for precisely that reason. Russia sees this clearly. According to Kolesnikov's account, Putin said so explicitly. At this point, the convergence between independent analysis and reported Russian perceptions is striking. When theory and practice align this closely, it is usually because they are both describing the same underlying reality. If there remained any ambiguity after the second-hand reports of Vladimir Putin's remarks to Russian business leaders, it was eliminated by the direct and unequivocal statements of Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. Ryabkov is not a man who indulges in rhetorical flourish. He speaks with the clarity of someone conveying settled positions, not trial balloons. In a televised interview, Ryabkov stated plainly that neither the Europeans nor the Ukrainian leadership appear to have any genuine interest in peace. He acknowledged that negotiations between the United States and Russia have been taking place and, until recently, had progressed constructively. However, he emphasized that Zelensky's 20-point proposal bears no relation to the 28 points discussed earlier with envoys in Moscow, proposals grounded in the understandings reached between Putin and Trump in Anchorage. Those Anchorage understandings are the foundation upon which Moscow remains prepared to negotiate. For precisely that reason, Ryabkov said, Russia has no interest whatsoever in Zelensky's plan. There is no confusion here, no ambiguity. The Russian position is consistent across channels, speakers, and formats. Ryabkov also confirmed reports that Moscow has received no fewer than 4 separate documents in recent days, each diverging in significant ways from the agreed 28-point framework. Russian dissatisfaction with these deviations has been formally communicated to Washington. What we are witnessing is not diplomacy in the traditional sense, but a chaotic proliferation of counterproposals, revisions, and political signaling that consumes time while producing nothing of substance. While this diplomatic theater grinds on fruitlessly, something else far more consequential has been unfolding largely unnoticed in Western media. It concerns the approximately 210 billion in Russian state assets frozen in Euroclear and other Western financial institutions. Here, the most detailed public account comes from Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister and a highly capable economist. Whether one agrees with Varoufakis politically is irrelevant. He is well-connected, well-informed, and careful when making public claims of this magnitude. According to Varoufakis, Russia's response to Western plans to use frozen assets as collateral for loans to Ukraine has not been limited to a single legal action in Moscow. Instead, Moscow has launched a coordinated global legal offensive. Proceedings have been initiated in approximately 13 or 14 jurisdictions worldwide. These include courts in Europe, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, a Swiss commercial court, U.S. courts in Singapore, and others. The trigger for this legal campaign was the European proposal to use frozen Russian assets as collateral for a 140 billion loan to Ukraine without Russia's consent. While the European Council later reduced the loan to 90 billion and abandoned the collateral scheme, this did not halt any of the legal proceedings. Russia has continued pressing forward in every jurisdiction. Until Varoufakis publicly discussed this, there had been almost no reporting on it in London or elsewhere in the Western press. That silence alone is revealing. Varoufakis further states that Russia's legal team is composed of top international jurists and lawyers drawn from multiple countries and notably not Russians. These are specialists in sovereign immunity and international financial law. They are not arguing an exotic or novel case. They are arguing established law. At the core of Russia's argument is state sovereign immunity. Russian state assets, they contend, are protected under international law. The freezing of those assets in February 2022 was itself of dubious legality. Subsequent European schemes to exploit, collateralize, or confiscate those assets only compounded that illegality. This argument has been made repeatedly over the past months, not just by Russian officials, but by the IMF, the European Central Bank, Euroclear itself, and numerous EU legal experts. Far from resolving the legal problem, Europe's increasingly elaborate proposals merely highlighted how legally indefensible the entire enterprise had become. According to Varoufakis, Russia's statement of case runs to approximately 840 pages. It is densely documented, heavily cited, and devastatingly thorough. Even more damaging for the EU, It reportedly quotes internal EU documents, records of debates, memoranda, and warnings in which European officials themselves acknowledged the legal risks and potential illegality of what they were proposing. This has reportedly caused alarm within European institutions. Questions are being asked about how Russia obtained these documents through hacking or through sympathetic insiders. That question, however, is largely beside the point. What matters is that the documents exist and are now part of the evidentiary record. Two courts, the Swiss Commercial Court and the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, have already issued injunctions preventing any action involving the frozen assets until substantive rulings are made. These are preliminary decisions, but they are highly significant. Varoufakis also confirms that Russia is invoking bilateral investment and commercial treaties with Belgium and other EU states to establish additional tribunals, each capable of adjudicating the same claims. There is also mention of proceedings at the International Court of Justice. In other words, this is not a single case. It is a legal encirclement. The strategic asymmetry here is brutal. For the European Union to prevail, it must win in every jurisdiction. Russia needs to win in only one to obtain an enforceable judgment. EU legal services are reportedly under immense strain, drafting technically competent but fundamentally weak responses, arguments that even their authors may not fully believe in. According to Varoufakis, legal advice is already circulating within EU institutions, suggesting that allowing these cases to proceed to final judgment may be unwise. A negotiated settlement returning at least some of the money to Russia might be preferable. That alone speaks volumes. If such a settlement were to occur, it would not be minor. Russia would demand substantial restitution. The original freeze of Russian assets was the most dramatic and symbolically important sanction imposed in February 2022. A legal defeat here would shatter the credibility of the entire sanctions regime. The political consequences would be enormous. Leaders who championed the freeze would face humiliation. European taxpayers would bear the cost. Confidence in the EU's legal and financial integrity would erode steadily over the 2 or 3 years this litigation is expected to take. Having been involved in complex litigation myself, I can say that this slow drip of adverse rulings, injunctions, and procedural defeats is precisely how pressure accumulates. Confidence evaporates long before final judgment. Varoufakis' account aligns closely with comments made separately by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who has also alluded to significant legal action underway. Even if some details prove imperfect, the overall picture is compelling and consistent with established legal principles. If Europe is eventually forced to compromise, that compromise will not be confined to financial questions. It will inevitably spill over into geopolitics. The European position on Ukraine, which already shows signs of strain, could fracture entirely. This context sheds new light on Emmanuel Macron's recent comments suggesting that the time has come to reopen dialogue with Russia. Macron is an intellectually complex figure, capable of insight and folly in equal measure. It is not difficult to imagine him grasping the implications of this legal crisis faster than many of his peers and concluding that negotiations with Moscow are no longer optional. Beneath the sanctions edifice constructed by Ursula von der Leyen and others, a clock is ticking. Each filing, each injunction, each leaked document accelerates the countdown. In my judgment, if Varoufakis' account is broadly accurate, and I see no reason to doubt it, this legal offensive is the most important development of the past 2 weeks. It dwarfs the sterile diplomatic maneuvering and may ultimately overshadow even battlefield developments. While Western diplomats recycle paper and lawyers quietly panic over injunctions, the war itself continues to impose its own unforgiving logic. Wars, unlike press conferences, do not respond to narratives. They respond to logistics, manpower, firepower, and time. On all 4 measures, the balance has been shifting steadily and increasingly irreversibly in Russia's favor. The most persistent Western misconception is that the front line represents a static contest of positions. This is a comforting illusion. What is actually unfolding is a cumulative process of Ukrainian force degradation. Territory changes matter less than force integrity. and Ukrainian force integrity has been deteriorating for months. Russian operations over the past year have not aimed at dramatic breakthroughs. They have aimed at exhaustion. This is not accidental. It is doctrinal. Russian military thinking has long emphasized the destruction of the enemy's operational reserves rather than theatrical territorial gains. The logic is brutally simple. Once reserves are depleted, maneuver becomes impossible, morale collapses, and the front disintegrates on its own. The map changes rapidly only at the very end of this process, not at the beginning. Zaporizhia is a case study. Ukrainian formations there were repeatedly committed in penny packets, brigades fed into the line without adequate artillery cover, air defense, or logistical depth. Western-supplied armor, touted endlessly in the press, arrived without the combined arms infrastructure required to support it. Tanks without air superiority and artillery dominance are not force multipliers. They are targets. Russian forces responded not with reckless counterattacks, but with layered defense, precision strikes, and systematic attrition. Ukrainian units advanced into fire sacks, suffered losses, withdrew, and were then redeployed elsewhere in a weakened state. The result was not a dramatic Russian victory, but something far more damaging to Ukraine. Cumulative depletion. Kupiansk reveals the same pattern from the opposite direction. Russian pressure there has forced Ukraine to redeploy already strained units from other sectors, thinning defenses across the board. This is operational shaping. Every Ukrainian reinforcement sent to Kupiansk is a reinforcement, not sent elsewhere. Russia does not need to capture Kupiansk immediately. It only needs to force Ukraine to defend it. Western analysts often speak as if Ukraine possesses an unlimited pool of trained manpower. This belief borders on fantasy. Ukraine has been mobilizing progressively older men, lowering training standards, and shortening preparation cycles. Reports of newly mobilized units breaking under fire are no longer anecdotal. They are systemic. Russian forces, by contrast, are operating with interior lines, stable logistics, and an expanding pool of trained personnel. Mobilization, once portrayed as a political gamble for Moscow, has settled into administrative routine. Rotation cycles exist, units are rested, retrained, and returned to the line. This is what sustainability looks like. Artillery remains decisive, and here the disparity is stark. Russian shell production has increased dramatically, while Ukrainian forces ration fire. Western promises of ammunition have repeatedly fallen short, not because of political bad faith alone, but because Western industrial capacity simply cannot match the scale of consumption in a high-intensity land war. Air power tells a similar story. Russian aviation operates with increasing confidence, employing glide bombs and standoff munitions beyond the reach of Ukrainian air defenses. Each strike degrades fortifications painstakingly built over months. Ukrainian air defense systems, meanwhile, are stretched thin, protecting cities, infrastructure, and frontline forces simultaneously. Something always goes uncovered. What is often missed is the psychological dimension of this imbalance. Ukrainian soldiers know when artillery support is absent. They know when rotations are delayed. They know when evacuation is slow. Morale erodes not in sudden collapses, but in quiet decisions to retreat early, to conserve ammunition, to avoid unnecessary exposure. Discipline frays at the edges first. Russian forces exploit this patiently. Advances are often measured in hundreds of meters, not kilometers. Western commentators scoff at such gains, misunderstanding their significance. These advances represent the progressive biting off of Ukrainian defensive belts, each one thinner and less cohesive than the last. The Ukrainian command structure itself is under strain. Commanders are pressured politically to hold ground that is no longer militarily defensible. This is a classic failure mode. When political imperatives override operational judgment, losses mount rapidly. Units ordered to hold at all costs often do exactly that until they cannot, at which point collapse is sudden and catastrophic. None of this suggests an imminent, dramatic Russian breakthrough tomorrow. That expectation is a Western projection, shaped by cinematic notions of warfare. What it does suggest is something more ominous for Kyiv: a narrowing set of options. Ukraine can continue fighting, but only by consuming its remaining manpower and materiel faster than they can be replaced. It can attempt another major offensive, but without surprise, mass, or air superiority. Such an effort would likely accelerate depletion rather than reverse it. Or it can seek negotiations from a position that worsens with each passing month. Russia understands this dynamic perfectly. Time is not a neutral variable, it is a weapon. Every month that passes under current conditions improves Russia's relative position. This is why Moscow shows no urgency at the negotiating table and no anxiety on the battlefield. Western leaders, by contrast, appear trapped by their own rhetoric. Having framed the conflict in absolute moral terms, they have left themselves little room to maneuver. Compromise becomes betrayal. Negotiation becomes appeasement. Strategic reality is subordinated to narrative maintenance. But narratives do not stop artillery shells. As Ukrainian defensive cohesion continues to erode quietly, unevenly, but inexorably, the strategic picture clarifies. The question is no longer whether Ukraine can achieve its maximal objectives. It is whether it can avoid a settlement imposed under far worse conditions than those available earlier. This is the logic driving Moscow's approach across all domains: legal, diplomatic, and military. Each reinforces the other. Each operates on a longer timeline than Western politics is comfortable with. And each steadily constrains Ukraine's future choices.